Welcome to today's live online webinar. I'm Steve Bailey, and happy St. Paddy's Day to all of you. We're looking forward to spending the next hour with you. I'll be doing my usual advancing the slides and talking at the same time, which some days can be problematic, like just right now. So we'll try and do hand-eye coordination the best that we can this morning. We are recording this, just so you know. We have people that are unable to attend today and wanted to know if we were going to record it. And of course, we're trying to do that with all of our webinars. And you can find them always on the NMA website under the Professional Development drop-down menu. And just go to NMA Courses and Webinars, and you'll see a listing of everything that's available free of charge to you to utilize in Lunch and Learns or any other activity. So we do that for you as another service. So we will stop a couple of times during the presentation and then at the end, because I always like to get input. I think that's the best part, is usually the most fun part, and wanting to know what your experiences are, because you're out there in the trenches every day working virtually. So let's begin by taking a look at some learning objectives. So we're talking today about secrets, so none of this should really be top secret. We're going to examine some realities of working virtually. I really think that's where we need to start. Just kind of making sure that there's clarity in terms of what working virtually is and what some of the challenges are. That includes then understanding what distance does to things, looking at cultural differences, taking a look at something I consider very important for working virtually, that's interpersonal trust. We're going to talk about some kickoff strategies. One of the things I've learned in studying this subject is that how you get out of the gate is important. Recognizing the importance of accountability. That's the big bugaboo many times in organizations in general, in teams, no matter who's on them, and certainly in virtual teams. We're going to talk a little bit about conflict. To me, it's one of the secrets is to just have conflict awareness. Dealing with conflict is its own issue. And then we're going to highlight at the end some best practices and share some lessons learned. So, it's no secret that working virtually is the new normal. The challenges and opportunities of working virtually are staggering. And I'll admit at the front end, it's not always my favorite way of working. I don't pretend to have mastered it, but I'm kind of coming at the subject today from a perspective of why I can hate it sometimes and trying to take a look at, okay, how could I avoid some of the problems that I've seen and participated in and maybe actually have had a hand in, unfortunately, when it comes to working virtually. One thing I have learned is that working virtually has its own rules. But learning how to work virtually is a competitive advantage for you, for your team, and most importantly, for your company. Because the organizations that get it right are going to leapfrog ahead of everybody else who struggles with it. One of the things I found over the weekend, actually, was this. It's called the new org chart. Basically, what this is saying is that the old way of doing things, where there was a discernible, very clear org chart, really isn't how we do it anymore. Things are scrambled, both virtually and sometimes in the same building. And really what it is, it's a matter of teams that are networking to get the job done. And what's important is in that last circle that the values are shared, that there's a culture for the team, the goals and projects are transparent, so free flow, that's hard to say, of information, and then people get rewarded for what they do, not for where they sit. And strangely enough, when I saw this, I went, yep, this really gets to most of the things we're going to talk about today. So there are three driving forces behind working virtually. The first is technology. Technology makes it easier. Yeah, there are some days when we all want to throw a shoe through the computer, but by and large, it's because we can work virtually that we do. Another force is the nature of the work itself. In other words, there aren't as many manufacturing environments anymore where people are out on the floor and it's hands-on and it's kinesthetic. But rather it's work where we're sharing information. And information can be shared in many ways, certainly virtually. And then last, just the whole globalization of talent. The fact that in many organizations, if the expertise on a particular topic isn't down the hall, well, maybe it's across town, maybe it's in another state, or maybe it's in another country. So those are the forces that have gotten us where we are. So how are we defining virtual? You can define it any way you want, but I think one of the best ways to say it's a situation where the leader is separated from all of the people that he or she leads, and that those people may be separated from everybody else, or they may be in clumps, but by and large, you're not in the same place at the same time. You may not even work for the same organization. These days, when there are multiple contracts, especially those of you doing government work, doing aerospace and defense, you might be working cross-culturally with other organizations. So that has its own rules and its own hiccups. So that's kind of how we're going to define virtual today. Some group discussion that I hope you'll have. Actually, I think we're just going to go ahead and open the phone lines. I remember I made a note here to do that. So that kind of early on, I could pick your brains. So I put two questions on the screen here. One is, what are the best parts of working virtually? And secondly, what are some of your frustrations with it? So I'd kind of like to hear those on the front end, and hopefully we'll address them as we progress through the rest of the hour. Anybody want to be the first guinea pig and speak up?
Yeah, this is Avis. I have something to say.
Okay, thank you, Avis.
I particularly wanted to join this webinar. I don't work for salary anymore, so I'm not working in industry, but I am working with a lot of volunteer organizations who generally don't use virtual meetings because either they don't see a need or they don't see how to make them work. In the volunteer sector, you have a wide disparity of schedules, tools, technical knowledge, big cultural gaps.
Yep.
And I'm hoping that today I will maybe come up with some ideas that I can put forward to these organizations and see if we can start working virtually.
Okay. Everybody else has heard that, and so we'll hope we answer that as we go along. We get to the end. If we haven't done it, we'll get some input from others. I don't pretend to have all the answers. So, but that is a very good point. When you're all working for the same organization, there are commonalities that you're not going to find in the volunteer world, and especially with maybe sometimes older people who've retired and who are volunteering their time and talents, but maybe left the workforce before working virtually became the norm. Thanks, Avis. Who else?
I'd like to mention one. My day job is human resources. So in a virtual world, trying to tackle performance and corrective action and just trying to have that candid, honest conversation virtually just doesn't work real well.
No, it does not. And I would imagine there are some people that like it because they don't have to do the face-to-face, but obviously you're with me in that don't use virtual techniques as a substitute or an inability to deal with things head on, right?
That's correct. In our case, it takes human out of human resources.
Oh, I like that. In fact, I'm going to steal that. All right.
You can give me a couple of dollars in the mail, though.
We're not. Please remember, we're not for profit. Anybody else? Third time's charm.
Yes, Steve.
Yeah.
So one of the best things I like about virtual teams, if it is compatible time, is the saving of time, actually, or transportation. A lot of times I feel half the day, if not more, is spent walking to the meeting, which is a mile or half a mile down, and by the time you're done with all those meetings, I mean, where did the time go? So if you're able to virtually meet with people instead of having to go in person, I mean, there are some things you might have to do in person, but we also have monitors where we can actually see each other, get that facial expression and recognition. So I think if we have an infrastructure to where we can have virtual meetings, it might be more of a common thing. And the people are used to it, open to it.
Good for you. That's the right attitude. And I think it works. I draw the line a little bit on working virtually with the person in the next cubicle. Okay. Anybody else want to add anything?
Yes, hi, this is Linda. One of the things I prefer about working virtually, you have that sense of autonomy. And there's an opportunity where you can become more familiar with the technology and even set the pace for your team and encourage them to, further using technology. But then also, for some people who are, more socially inclined or love, social butterfly, that may be a frustration for them that they don't have.
You've looked at my slides ahead of time. We're going to talk about that. You're exactly right. Thanks. All right, I'm going to ask Sue to mute everybody, and we'll trudge on, and then we'll open the lines a little bit later and get some more input. Thank you, everybody. That was great. Sometimes we don't have the social butterflies on, but today we do. So we appreciate your. All right, let's look at some challenges of working virtually. To me, one of the biggest factors is just getting your arms around the concept of virtual distance. And when we were putting together the NMA course on this, I found this subject and this particular graphic to be very important because virtual distance means many things. There's affinity distance, there's operational distance, there's physical distance. And I'm looking forward to a slide here. What we're talking is, all right, physical distance. Well, that's the obvious one. You're not in the same room, or you're not in the same building, or you're not in the same city, or you're not in the same company, or you're not in the same time zone. So those physical distances create challenges. And while we're talking about secrets, and we'll get to all this, but on the front end, the secret is to remember what it is you need to know about where other people on your team are physically located and what can you do to make life easier for them. I know I was chatting with a lady not long ago that said most of her meetings on one team are at 2 a.m. for her. And I said, do they not rotate the times? She said, no. And I'm going, oh, good. That must just be loads of fun. Affinity distance. Let's go to operational distance first. The operational distance means that there's no connection between you and the others. And that can be because people are multitasking. People aren't as ready to be members of the team maybe as they should be. There can be problems with communications equipment. There can be an unequal distribution of work among certain people. So there's a lot of things that can create this operational distance. And then there's the one that's called affinity distance. And really that is kind of summarized in the inability to build relationships, cultural, personal, interpersonal. There's social distance, there's cultural distance, there's relationship distance. And what do we mean by that? Well, that can be that not everybody on the, you just don't know each other as well as you should. It could also be a lack of familiarity with how things work. And what I mean by that is one office may kind of just do things differently than another. There are norms in some organizations that aren't necessarily the same in other organizations. And then there's interdependence distance, and that's when people just kind of think independently and they don't really have that mental connection to what's going on. Sometimes that happens when someone's put a gun to someone's head, and that's why they're on this team. There can be a lot of reasons for that. All of these things we'll talk about a little bit more. Steve's got to keep an eye on the clock. All right. Some characteristics of a virtual team. Well, to me, these are painfully obvious, but you got to go back. You got to look at them. You got to recall them. They're often cross-country, if not completely global. A virtual team is typically multicultural or multi-generational. We already talked about across time zones, and they can be across organizational boundaries. Kind of a summary of what we were talking about. The role of feelings. I read someplace that conventional wisdom holds that the major disadvantage of virtual teams are the lack of physical interaction. And that seems to be true the further you get into this subject. One guy in the Harvard Business Review, let's see, his name was Charles Handy, he wrote an article, and I love this sentence. He goes, "Few are going to be eager advocates of virtuality, when it really means that work is what you do, not where you go." And the more I thought about that, I'm like, man, is that a sign of the times or what? Work has become what we do, not where we go. A couple other researchers from the Academy of Management stated, probably the most commonly expressed challenge of working virtually is overcoming the isolation caused by the separation from the social network of the traditional workplace. And they went on to say that employees often comment that they miss the informal interaction just by being in the presence of other people on the team. For some of us, that's a bigger factor than others. And yet, there is a flip side to this thing. If people can make friends and fall in love over the internet, why on earth can't virtual workers manage to forge relationships and learn how to work together? I mean, think about it. There's Facebook, Matchmaker.com, all those organizations out there. So as a society, we are becoming increasingly accustomed to forming friends, having networks, establishing relationships, and yet we kind of fight it sometimes when it comes to the workplace. So just something worthy of consideration. And then there's a third side. That's the side that some people just want to be left alone. They really don't like collaborative work, no matter where you're doing it, whether it's around a table or on the phone. So one secret to all this is to recognize that whether you're a leader or whether you're a member of the team, you are going to have folks who love it and folks who resist it. And as a leader, you've got to have an ear, if not an eye, for things that are going on, maybe a little bit behind the scenes. So let's talk a little bit about some short-term strategies to manage distance. If you can hold face-to-face meetings, do so. If you can bring people in, if it's once a year, once a quarter, whatever, do so. Occasional face-to-face, if you can pull it off at all, are really important. And I know we run into that even with our NMA Board of Directors meetings. We do a lot of work virtually. Committees work online. The officers and I work online. But coming together in January and again in June and again at the annual conference is absolutely essential to keeping the wall together, to keeping Humpty Dumpty on top of it and not below. Rotate meetings if you can. I know some of our Lockheed Martin Aeronautics chapters have synergy meetings, and they go back and forth among Fort Worth and Palmdale and Marietta and Greenville and maybe Kings Bay. Well, that's Space Systems. But I know they move them around to accommodate people in their schedules. Create some cross-functional ad hoc teams if you need to. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes the committee as a whole doesn't have to be working on every single piece of the puzzle. Sometimes work can best be done if it's broken into smaller groups, and 2 or 3 people go off to the side and bring something back. And certainly the other secret on this slide is to ensure that people have access to the right resources. Such a simple thing as you have the right software. Can everybody in various places, are there firewall issues? And can everyone access your project meeting software, for instance? So that's part of a leader, is making sure that people have what they need to get the job done, because it's really frustrating when you don't. And frustrations can be handled sometimes walking down the hall. If you're working virtually, you're just sitting there stewing, and that doesn't help anybody. So just be aware of who else might need something that they don't have or you have. Some longer term strategies, be an alert manager. Those of you that have gone to chapter leader training conferences know that I often like to say some leaders are like the bottom half of a double boiler. They get all steamed up, but they don't know what's cooking. And you have to have that kind of awareness. We'll talk some more about that. Make sure there's a common context. Are you using language and terminology that everybody on the team is aware of? Reduce multitasking when you can. If you're a leader or a manager, and part of the challenge I know a lot of people face on virtual teams, it's like, oh my God, I've got so much going on. I just don't feel I can contribute much to this team. Or worse yet, they're online participating and maybe they're doing something else, and you don't need that. Foster attachments and build relationships. Incentivize teamwork. And then understand the status quo. Keeping a database of who's doing what, who has what kinds of experiences. Those are just some additional strategies or secrets for success. Is there an impact to cultural differences? You bet. Cultural differences are one of a virtual team's most challenging boundaries. And those differences can be national, or they can be simply organizational. They can also be functional. So it's understanding that we live in a global neighborhood. There's also personal preferences in terms of how people work. It's not always a matter of what's right and what's wrong. Sometimes it depends. So if you're on a virtual team, it's just kind of letting the walls down a little bit, being open, being a little more acceptable. There's something new in the workplace. Used to be nothing but IQ. And then a few years ago, we started talking about EQ, or emotional intelligence. And now most organizations have said there's a third component here called cultural intelligence, or CQ. So how do you measure success? How do you ensure that everybody is aware of what's going on culturally? Well, to me, number one, it's through this second little graphic here in terms of drive. That's really your motivation, your interest and your confidence in functioning effectively in cross-organizational, cross-cultural settings. Knowledge, it's cognition. How well do you really understand any different cultures that are on your team? CQ strategy is how you make sense out of culturally different experiences. And lastly, it is action or behavior, and that's your own capability to adapt to different cultures. And that's just many times getting a handle on yourself. You need to find your global lens, and that's the secret. You use culture as a competitive advantage, but you can also take advantage of technology. There are many things, I was reading a great story about how this one team, they had someone who really didn't, they did a lot of group chatting, and people were encouraged to type into their computers as everything was going on, and they noticed that this one individual just didn't seem to participate. Well, it took a while to get to the bottom of it. And when they got to the bottom of it, it was that this individual, English was not their first language, and they were afraid of being embarrassed. They didn't want to type because they didn't want to misspell, or they didn't want to use the wrong word. They didn't want to be thought of as anything less than equal to other members on the team. So there are ways to deal with that. You can assign an editor to help somebody who maybe has to develop a written piece of a proposal. There's software for, grammar and those spelling and thesauruses and all those kinds of, so there's just other ways to deal with someone else's lack of, shall we say, sophistication in terms of what he or she can contribute via language and whatnot. Another thing to me, and I actually wrote it down this morning as I was looking through this, I'm not sure it fits on this slide, but I'm putting it there, and that is, don't do such things as referencing documents that everybody on the team hasn't seen. And I know we've all been through that. Someone will reference an email or reference a document that was sent out, and you just go sit there and go, excuse me, I didn't see that thing. And then someone has to take the time. There's usually, thank God, usually somebody who will volunteer, say, well, I'll go find it and I'll send it to person A. But that just kind of, you kind of lose your momentum, and there's a mojo that develops when you're working virtually that you don't want to lose. I think it's important as we kind of wrap up this piece to remind ourselves that culture is not just about ethnicity. It's about having, you probably think I'm going off the cliff like Thelma and Louise here in the convertible, but I'm not. I'm just trying to remind us all that culture is about our different upbringings, our families, our schooling, our education, the fact that some of us may have special skills, how long we've been with the company, what part of the country do we live in? Even such a thing as, I'm one of those disgusting morning people that the rest of you hate. So, we need to work around that. Some people are really productive in the morning. Others really fire up about 3 in the afternoon. But we have to know that about other people. Certainly different religions. And one of the things I wrote down over the weekend was personal situations. Well, what do I mean by that? Culture can just be how we are living in a moment of time. In other words, if you have a single mom who's on your team and she has a child in daycare, and she absolutely has to be out of there to pick the child up by 6 p.m. Well, you need to understand that. Any leader does, whether it's a virtual team or not. But it's just making sure that we are aware of people's situations. So that then leads us to what are the keys? Well, I found something called the 3 C's of virtual team leadership, and that's identified as collaboration, as commitment, and community. Collaboration is the key. That's what you're striving for on a virtual team. It's not necessary to begin with everybody on the same page. In fact, part of the beauty of a virtual team or any team is that people are bringing those differences, cultural, educational, personal, experiential, whatever, bringing all that to the table. That's actually good. That's a competitive advantage. Nobody is as smart as all of us. But then at some point in time, you've got to develop the commonalities, even if you have to invent options for mutual gain. And you want to integrate the diverging viewpoints. So lastly, it's remembering, and to me, I marked this in my notes this morning as, here's the big secret on this page. Whether or not we're using the term commitment or the phrase employee engagement, that's the big buzz, one truth emerges. These things are choices. It never happens automatically. You cannot force someone to be committed to a cause or to a project. An organization can't demand that an employee be engaged. It doesn't work that way. But what we can do, and I think this is really key to a team, especially a virtual one, what we can do is to create that atmosphere where there is a mindset that it's safe and that my contributions are welcome, and that this team will get the job done, and that we are all respected, and there's clarity of purpose, which we're going to talk about in a second. In other words, it's up to the leader, and then to some extent all the rest of us, to create the feeling that being on this team is worthwhile. And that is how you get people engaged. And it really gets down to the essence of trust. And I think one of the biggest mistakes anybody on a virtual team, especially the leader, can make is to assume that trust happens automatically, or to underestimate the power of it. I mean, come on. No group, no family, no church group, no volunteer group, no work group goes together very easily if people don't trust one another. So the fact that virtuals might be outside the realm of being down the hall means that it's even harder. So we have to, it requires leadership to set the values and to inspire trust. How do we do that? Number one of the secrets is to tout the competence of everybody. Make sure that everybody else on the team knows the expertise of his or her colleagues. Make sure the goals are clear. It is amazing how a team can get crosswise, how any group of people can get crosswise. And sometimes it's more than setting goals on the front end. It's constantly coming back and reinforcing it. To me, the third one is huge. Share power. I found something in Forbes that said a study of visual teams in a Fortune 500 global IT company found that on teams that had a high degree of trust, power had actually been shifted among the members depending upon the stage of the project. Well, that can mean many things, but what I think it means most is that everybody's capable of stepping up and leading a piece of the puzzle. That it doesn't have to be, there has to be one overall leader, but along the way, other folks can take on ownership of making sure that something is done. And then, of course, obviously, setting a positive tone. A little more on virtual relationship building. Start your meetings with a take 5 if you can. Who's doing what? What's going on in their life? Give us an update on you, your family, whatever. Take a few moments to allow people to share what's going on. Someone far wiser than I said to me years ago, Steve, in any meeting, people have telling tension. And I said, what's that? They said it can be something about the actual project that's going on, or it may be something exciting in their lives that they want to share. And you might as well let everybody get that out before a meeting starts. Does it take a little time? It can. And it shouldn't have to take 20 minutes every time the group gets together. But I think it's important to remember more than, I hope everyone is well, let's get to work. Take a little front end time. Invest in an intranet site that allows people to go in and share information. So it doesn't always have to come out during your meeting, that people can post. Those of you that have ever gone doing advanced schoolwork, maybe working on a master's and you're doing it online, you're getting your degree that way. One of the things that they do is make sure that everybody has to post and everybody has to participate. Your virtual team should be doing that, and should be doing so on a regular basis. I said earlier, one of the things is to get off on the right foot. First of all, kind of make sure that the team is a manageable size. Virtual teams can be too large. There's no greater opportunity for building an effective team than at the outset. So it's okay to take time to do that right. That first meeting can be almost entirely social, and then get down to the big picture. What is it the team's going to be working on, and what questions do people have on the front end? Make sure that you choose that virtual team leader wisely. Not everybody likes to work virtually, and not everybody's going to be a good virtual team leader. Not everybody has the time. So that's probably one of the most critical things that can happen. Then, determine performance recognition. In other words, how will successful performance be recognized and rewarded? Group celebrations. Well, will there be bonuses? And I figure some of you are laughing. But they can be effective rewards. Make sure that people on the team know that upper management, executive management is expecting this team to deliver. Because one of the worst things that can happen is I'm swamped, I've got a million things going, and all of a sudden I end up on a virtual team, and suddenly my boss doesn't value that. So you've got to have an awareness of someone may have trouble participating on the team time-wise. You don't want someone having to do all their work off hours. There needs to be some upfront understanding as to what this team is doing, why individuals X, Y, and Z have been asked to be on it. So hold a great kickoff meeting, and that can, I'm not going to get into details there, but the kickoff, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. And then hold team development activities along the way. Find ways to allow people to get to know one another, because that is the essence of trust. Communication strategies are key. Do you have a plan? What do we mean by that? Well, what technology are we all going to use? What browsers are people using? What software are we doing? How will the team share documents? How will you do updates? Agree on how the team's progress will be shared and with whom. That's the update piece. Clarify communication needs and desires of team. What does that mean? Most of us handle email differently. There are some people that, they keep it on their other screen and they kind of handle it as it comes in. Others do it before work or after work. Others have a time during the day when they do email. I mean, we've all been victims of someone who sends an email at 2:09 in the afternoon, and at 2:11 they call you to ask if you've gotten their email yet. Are you, hello? You might be doing something else. So it's learning, all right, so I send an email during the day on Tuesday. What does the team expect in terms of response? Should there be a response by the end of the day? Should there be a response the first thing the next morning? Is there a 24-hour window? Those are the things that can get people twisted in a heartbeat if those aren't identified on the front end. And lastly here, if there's some technology, some software that some folks aren't as familiar with as others, find a way to get everybody on the same page there as quickly as possible. I found that, doing a lot of this during the kickoff meeting is key. What will be the technology? Are there rules for teleconferencing? You want people on there 5 minutes early? Are people expected to just chime in? Are you going to hold sessions at the end where people will talk? Just make sure that you are getting input from what people need. And I already talked about turnaround time. How about feedback? There's nothing worse than a team that's functioning virtually for weeks and the leader hasn't privately maybe pulled people aside and say, how's it going? Any issues? What can we do to make these more effective? We've all been on teams where the whole thing gets frustrating somewhere along the line. And are you free to share that information or what? So a leader's got to be on top of that one. So begin with clarity of purpose. We all have this. We all have the same vision. Are we all expecting the same results? We don't have the luxury of checking signals at the water cooler or at lunch. So the more time you spend with this on the front end, the better. Even small things. Who's going to take minutes? I recently was participating in something, and after the fact, we discovered no one had taken minutes. We forgot to identify that on the front end. So, those are the details that can trip you up in a heartbeat. Establish some rules of engagement. This is actually a matrix that's out there. You can run into it all over the internet. Basically what it says is, for meetings, You know, what kind of meetings, who will be there, how are we going to do them, when are we going to have them, where they're going to be, communications, conflict resolution, decision-making, same kind of thing. What decisions do we need to make, and who's the final decision maker, and how do we make them? Are there deadlines? Are there checkpoints along the way? Where do we do this? Do we do it collectively? Do we do it offline? There's just a million things to consider to make a team run well. And each one has a different answer. But what I would encourage you to do is to make sure that there is an established place where rules of how your team is going to engage are there for people to double check and understand. That then leads to an important piece called accountability. Huge issue in the workplace, as we all know. Creating virtual accountability is not easy. So who's going to be accountable for what? How do you hold people accountable virtually? You can't force it, but you can encourage it. How does the leader keep an eye on it? I had to learn the lesson a hard way many years ago that a low-performing team member can bring down the entire team if you don't deal with it. So that's important. Creating it, well, there's 4 pillars of accountability. It's called, number 1, responsibility. And that's the duty that binds you to a course of action. There's answerability, being called into account. Trustworthiness. Is everybody on the team worthy of trust by everybody else, deemed worthy of trust? And then liability, being legally bound to a debt or obligation. So it's understanding all of those when it comes to dealing with the virtual team. Let's go to the next slide here. I'm kind of keeping an eye on the clock. Creating virtual accountability. What is it seems to drive people the most crazy? It's not about being held responsible. I think most of us, we're there. We don't mind being held responsible, but it's when we're not clear about what we're being responsible for. It's understanding what's expected. It's knowing what's expected of you. That's partly the leader's responsibility to do that on the front end, but it's also yours and mine. If we're not clear, you got to ask. You have to find out, what do I need to do? How do I handle my own shortcomings? How do I balance everything with what else I'm doing? So creating accountability is the foundation of clarity in many ways. And I found an interesting article that talks about accountability by proximity. And that's called the tendency to manage accountability with those who are closest to us and less so with those who are further away. And that can be physically or otherwise. So find out, especially for the people that maybe aren't necessarily in the room or in your office or down the hall, what is it they need in order to get the job done, in order to be truly accountable. I found this, some of you may have seen, I put this on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, where Google, they were involved in something called Project Aristotle. And they actually did it over a period of about 3 years, where they really were looking internally. They scheduled interviews with hundreds of employees, and they were trying to find, is there a magic formula, the perfect mix necessary to form a stellar team? And they said the search for that, their assumptions were all wrong. And they came up with something called psychological safety. You know what that is? It just means, is it safe for me to have an opinion? Am I allowed to contribute without feeling like an idiot? How do you make sure that people aren't out of the loop? So Google says the best thing they can do is to make it safe. And in short, the secret to success is just be nice. Now, there's probably somebody out there that's ready to lose lunch before lunch over that one. but I think it says a lot about virtual teams. Why do I say that? You don't have that face to face. You don't get the nonverbal cues. So I know I've served on teams where people over the phone come across as pretty harsh, pretty non-understanding. And I think if we're working virtually, you and I just need to have the presence of mind to back up, back off, and realize, there's no sense in offending somebody if I can avoid it. Some days we can't avoid it despite our best intentions. But it's important to keep in mind that everybody struggles with it. And that kind of leads us to, as we work down the list of topics here, dealing with conflict. Hey, whenever people interact, there's potential for it. We all know it's going to happen. And in virtual environment is a double-edged sword because, you're not necessarily across from someone who sent you into orbit. But then again, you're not across from someone whom you maybe can pull into a conference room and sit down and go, do we need to talk? Do I need to explain what I said? So it is a double-edged sword. To me, for a virtual team, it's about developing conflict awareness. What I mean by that is there are signs that trouble is brewing because it's not always totally interpersonal. Sometimes it's just that there's an uneven sharing of workload. It could be that someone doesn't pay attention to emails that are sent out, and you get together and you're on the phone, you're talking about someone, and someone goes, I don't know if I saw that or not. Well, that doesn't work. So it's got to be dealt with. My favorite, passive aggressive. The person that's sitting there slightly stewing but not saying a thing, just kind of waiting. Domineering personalities, we've all been there. That can sidetrack me when I feel that someone else is just trying to run the show all the time and not being respectful of other people in the room. People feel pressured. We all feel pressure, but there are ways to inflict it, for lack of a better word, that are a little softer than others. What do I mean by too much quiet time? Who's the person that never seems to contribute? More importantly, why? Are they not prepared? Do they not feel psychologically safe? Do they not understand what's going on? Is their skill set not what it needs to be? So I found this, and I just love this. Someone came up with, here's a mind map for resolving conflict. I'm like, oh my God, it can't be that difficult. I would rather say, all right, let's outline a few simple steps, some secrets. Establish some team norms. Make sure that everybody on the front end knows how we're going to deal with conflict. Have a procedure for handling grievances. If there's something obvious that's going wrong, do you go off site? Do you go offline? How do you do it? Developing those personal relationships. If I know you and I understand you, then chances are I'll work with you better and I'll understand what you meant by that. And I might recognize that there's a personal situation going on in your life, which maybe makes you a little short. Use online discussion boards. If you're really bummed out about something, talk with the team leader and express your concerns. Understand the concepts of compromise and consensus. Goodness knows we're fighting out in this election mess that we're all in. Some people say compromise is important. Others say you can't compromise. Others seek consensus. Others want their own way no matter what. Those things can really upend a team. And lastly here, if you've got something's going on, bring it up sooner rather than later. So at this point, we're looking at the clock. I think I'm going to scoot on by and we'll just ask you to hold this one until we're done. What are your lessons learned and best practices when it comes to resolving conflict? What I want to do is just kind of highlight here some best practices. What are the characteristics of a good team? You can read those. I don't want to be insulting and read them to you. All right, this is what we say are the characteristics of a good team. How about a good team member? And lastly, how about a good team leader? I think I'll highlight number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Resist the urge to micromanage. And number 8, eliminating roadblocks. If something's getting in the way of one of your team members or the whole team getting the job done, then as a team leader, you need to take care of it. So we are at the end of this. So I'm going to ask Sue if she'll open the lines. And according to my watch, we've got about 7 minutes or so where we can get some questions, get some ideas, get some input. So, Sue? Sue. Anybody?
Yes, this is Calvin Potts in Melbourne. You mentioned several articles as you went through the talk. By the way, thank you very much for sharing your ideas and your thoughts. A lot of good information. But in mentioning those articles like the Harvard Business Review and others, do you have a vehicle for providing links to those various articles to individuals on the call?
Let me go dig those up and I'll just send them to everybody.
Good.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It'll be tomorrow. It won't be today.
Well, that's fine. I'm just happy that you're willing to do that. Thank you.
Oh, sure. I don't. Yeah, you just want me to prove that I didn't do like I did a college term paper. I did a term paper, and I'm like, this really needs. I gotta remember, I was 19 years old, and I needed a really good quote. I couldn't find one, so I made one up and attributed it to Victor Hugo. Luckily, they didn't have computers. They didn't catch me. Today, that would not happen. All right, anybody? What have been some of your experiences or nightmares with working virtually? Everybody wants to relate to everyone else.
I'm reiterate what the other gentleman said. Yes, I thank you for sharing all of this because nowadays I believe the fact that there's so many organizations that have so many plants and people that's not in the same locations. This has become more and more essential and vital. But I think a lot of people, they don't really realize that this is what most organizations is coming to, is virtually, because like you say, you have so many things that's going on. People can't be the same place, the same time, doing the same things, always together. And true enough, there will always be something that's gonna not particularly work like, say, perfect, because nothing is perfect. But I think, first of all, like you said up front, you got to establish the team, let them know what you expect, when to expect, getting the necessary things to them that they need, setting deadlines, assigning people different things of that nature so that, working virtually can be just as well as, working within the office in the same place. So a lot of good points you made.
Well, a lot of good points you made. Thank you.
This is Avis.
Yes, ma'am.
I particularly like the 3 characteristics slides that you did. A lot of people understand what a good leader is, but in my experience, there are not an awful lot of people who understand what it means to be a good team member. And I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Avis, that's funny that you would bring that up because, as hopefully everybody knows, we've got a whole course on this subject. It's building virtual teams, and it's a short course. It's just 5 chapters and hopefully fun to put on, and I would encourage all of you to consider it, and it's cost effective. But we started out, the name of that course was Leading Virtual Teams. And that was the path we went down as we put it together. And I'm going to say maybe about 20% into this, looking at the subject matter, all of a sudden we realized, wait a minute, it's not about leading virtual teams. It's about everybody on the team participating. And building virtual teams means that everybody has ownership in that team's success, and they can't rely on just the leader. So you're right. That's what that's probably the biggest lessons learned from my looking at this entire subject, is that you can't sit back and blame or credit the leader for all of it. Everybody on the team has to assume some ownership in the eventual success of everything.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Now, I did find, thought I would share with you, here's another secret. Part of it is being comfortable working on a virtual team. So I will share one last secret with you that I found. I think that workstation, that actually works for me. I'm not sure I could get out of it, but. All right, anybody else? We're coming up on, yeah.
Steve.
Yes.
Yes, Steve, this is Victor. How are you?
Hi, Victor, down in Fort Walton Beach. How are you?
We're still expecting to see you down here in Fort Walton Beach, as you say you would. Yeah, I want to ask, how do you get the human back into the equation, since virtually, the human, like one of our participants asked before, the human component, it's pretty much essentially, non-existent. So how do you get the actual human interaction in? I mean, with all the processes involved, what exactly do you do to really close that gap?
That's a whole chapter in our book. First of all, I think in this case, it really does start from the top. Whoever's leading the virtual team has to understand that the secret to getting people working together is to develop trust and providing opportunities for people to connect. I think it's okay to encourage people's personalities to come out. But I really think, and it definitely sounds easier than it is, it's having focus. And it's realizing that people on the team want that, and that you have to create it. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think I work on a virtual team, and one of the things that we do that's very, very effective, as someone mentioned earlier on the call, you can't always travel and be in the same place, hence that's why we have the virtual teams. But when you have those opportunities to get together, it's really, really, really important to engage some social activities or hanging out, sharing food together, talking about your cultures, and not necessarily engage in just business during that time you are together, but to take some time to really get to know the other members of the team and get yourselves introduced. It goes a really long way when later on you're on a phone call and you recognize that voice, and mentally you have a face and a relationship to go with it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I read one article where people said it is possible to hang out virtually. And if you can't get together, then have a meeting, have a session where no work is conducted, but everybody's asked to share a couple pictures of themselves and their families, share a little bit about their background, their education, whatever, and develop that time. Now, I'm not an idiot. I know that there are some people out there for whom that would be a waste of time. And I guess all I can say is I'm sorry that that person doesn't get it. Because any secrets I've learned over time working for NMA, it's that people are assets. And we have to recognize that. And a team leader does everything she or he can to develop those assets and make sure people value one another.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
This is Avis again. I've been on a few teams where they have that kind of activity at the beginning of the project and at the end of the project. But I had been on one team where a couple of times, and this was a year-long project, that at least twice we had meetings that were just purely social, and they happened around either holidays or special events.
Yes.
And that works.
You bet. You bet it works.
It really does.
It's that mindset of taking time to do it right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All
right. By my clock here, it's 1 o'clock in Dayton, Ohio, so we've done our hour. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. The gentleman that asked me to send links, one of the challenges for me is I know who registered, but then I know there are many others in a room that I don't know you're on. So if you would send me a note and say, guess what, I'm the one that asked for the links, I'll make sure that you get them as well as everybody else. So,
hey,
thank
Steve,
you,
could
everybody.
you just send it to Brent?
I'm sorry?
Send it to Brent Mitchell, Steve.
Yeah, he just sends it.
Okay. I think we can trust Brent to send it out. So, known Brent a long time. So, okay, everybody. Thanks a lot, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you.